Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Zeller, and I'm your host for this session. Because this is a virtual session, everyone will need to post their questions in the chat in the virtual event. For those of you in person, you'll need to be logged in to the virtual event, go to Stages, then Grand 3, and here we are. I'll be monitoring your questions in chat, and we'll get them all at the end of the session. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Elizabeth Churchill.
Hello there, everyone. Thank you so much. And I want to say a big thanks to the organizers and to you, because for health reasons, I couldn't make it in person. So everybody has been very kind to set this up so I could do it remotely and stay home and be well. So I want to say a big appreciation to everybody. I am going to talk a little bit about some of my experiences thinking about UX and talking about UX in the corporate context. And so Joe, as one of the organizers, invited me to have a provocative title. And so my provocative title was, "There's no such thing as user experience, as UX," which of course I don't fully believe, but I wanted to be a little provocative as I think about sort of reflections on discussions about UX as a discipline that I've been having over many years, actually. And really what I wanted to do today was share with you some of the conversations I've had and ask, have you had similar conversations and what are your responses? So it's really about thinking about the discipline of UX and how we talk about ourselves. So that's what I'm here to discuss. And as I say, I'm sorry I'm not there in person, but happy to have discussions via various medias laters. So, of course, we know user experience, UX, has existed for quite a while. This is an Ngram viewer from Google, which just looks at the number of times the terms that are UX related have been used over the years. And you can see user experience really has been a main term in publishing for quite a long time. I put in customer experience, service design, and experience design as related terms because I think we often see those and are either directly involved in working on those as well, or see those as sister disciplines, if you like. So anyway, user experience as a term coined in the 1980s, 1990s, attributed to Don Norman and others, really has become a mainstay in our industry, a real term of art. But of course, there are deep roots. Before this term was used officially, the idea of experience, I like to think of sort of going back to, Feng Shui and the experience of being in a space. The idea of designing for experience has a long history. Also, the ancient Greeks thought about measurement and thought about experience design and user experience and human experience with tooling, a very, very long time ago, making all kinds of measures to understand how human bodies, ergonomics, if you like, really fit into the world of technology and tooling. So we have deep roots and it's a holistic endeavor. And part of why I want to have this conversation with you all is to think about how that holistic endeavor shows up in our daily practice in the world of technology and UX. So when I just did some searches earlier for the value of UX, what is UX? Very quickly, we find that we're doing a lot of work thinking about how to sell the value, how to talk about the value of UX. If you look at our related disciplines like software engineering, and when I put in value of software engineering, it's much more about values and less about identifying the clear value that the discipline brings to the production of experience and to the production of tools and artifacts that people want to use. people, everyday people, want to actually engage with. So I think this is one of the things that has been talked about quite a lot, which is the showcasing of value is often a conversation that we have, and we're always thinking about metrics and measures for how we show up and change the experience of any technology for our end users, for people. So I'm just going to go through some arguments, discussions that I've had over the years with various senior leadership around the term user experience and what it is that we do. And one of the statements that I have dealt with a few times, and again, I'm interested to see if you have too, is that experience as a word is too subjective. So the term experience cannot be designed since it's subjective and arises from the user themselves. So if I go back to Feng Shui, I'm not sure I believe this, but the counterpoint to that argument I have always given, and I would love to hear if you've heard that question and how you've responded, is the actual experience might be out of the designer or UX researcher, any UX functions control, but UX does aim to optimize the conditions that increase the likelihood of a positive experience, which of course comes to having a discussion about what a positive experience is. And I think one of the things in UX that we struggle with is there's the immediate positive experience and then the long-term value. And that itself is an open question. Are we designing something that has a quick hit that might have a decrease in engagement later? Or are we really building for long-term value? And that is a question that has come up many times in my career. So, you know, I tend to talk about what we do and why. And I say, well, we identify pain points, gaps in user needs, what might cause users frustration or lead them to abandon whatever we're building. We optimize for positive outcomes, as I said, how to craft the interactions that are pleasing, helpful, and meet the needs. And sometimes the needs we identify might not be the needs that users themselves identify as wanting, but over the long term, we see that the value sticks. We want to drive retention and loyalty, back to the short versus long-term goals. Positive experiences make people more likely to want to return to a product and recommend it to others. I think these are all pretty familiar. And we do want to differentiate. So in competitive markets, a superior user experience can be a strong advantage. And the question is, how do we then demonstrate that? So again, these are words that are breaking down what that subjective user experience is from a business value perspective. And under each of these are whole sets of methodologies for demonstration. So another argument or statement that has been made is that UX as a term, UX as a discipline is too broad. So user experience encompasses everything a user feels and experiences when interacting with a product or service. This includes usability, aesthetics, brand message, emotional impact, and more. The scope can be so broad that it seems nebulous or undefinable. So if I go back to that search that I did on different frameworks, or back to the statement around in the 80s and 90s and going on, we just defined user experience as this broad experience of all of the context that leads to what people are feeling or experiencing with a product or some kind of service designed for them. It can seem, I have been told, to senior leadership that, you know, this is too nebulous and too broad. And I don't know what you're talking about, Elizabeth. So, you know, I'll often try and break it down. And again, I want to know if this is what your practice is as well. But I say, you know, there are multiple elements of experience. There's a practicality. Can things get done? Can people do things efficiently, or do they feel friction? The emotions. Does the interaction lead to something which feels just seamless, or is it frustrating? Many experiences we have every day are very frustrating online, especially around things like security right now, but they can be very, very frustrating. Context: where and when is the product used? How does the environment influence the experience? You know, using your cell phone in bright sunlight is a very different experience from using it sitting on your couch. Does the product align with the user's beliefs and expectations and values? How is the brand received? We know from a lot of research in our community that strong brand alliances can kind of shape the feeling that people have when they use a product. And afterwards, do people remember this product positively? Do they want to use the product again? Aesthetics: is it consistent with brand? Is it pleasing? And of course, trust: do people have confidence? And of course, beyond the experience of the product itself, we often talk about, you know, what happens way beyond the interface. How does an app, an experience, a device change somebody's life? How does it make their life better? We can think about mapping applications and driving. You know, it's not about the application, it's about getting where you want to go. And then, you know, how do people discover the product before they even start to use it? When something breaks down, what happens with the customer service? And, you know, after use, what happens after use? Does it create a sense of, I'm going to do something different and I might come back later? You know, we have measures and metrics like everyday use, but sometimes it's a one-time use and you come back much later and it still is part of the value of your life. It really matters to you in your life. So when I talk about elements of experience and I'm told that UX is too broad as a concept, I try to break it down and I try to say it is subjective, but actually we have measures in all of these different areas that come together for the experience. It's holistic. And so that overarching overall impression that is left is the really important thing. But one of the problems that we have is that in our discipline, we often have small teams and all of these different aspects of the experience, we don't get to pull together into one story or talk to each other as we're looking at the different aspects of the experience. So, you know, the conversation with me, which is, you know, it's too broad, UX is too broad. Yes, but when I break it down, what we need to understand is how to get those conversations together and have, you know, marketing and branding and UX and measurement and data analytics of use all coming together to talk, because the disciplines need to come together that all touch on the different aspects of experience rather than being siloed. So I'd love to hear how anybody in the audience is dealing with this in your context. Often when I'm sharing all of these different aspects of how you measure in the short and long term, I'm told I'm boiling the ocean, which is quite frustrating. Another way I think about trying to break down UX is the use experience versus the user experience. The use experience tends to focus much more on that ergonomics history, the usability, efficiency, learnability of a particular tool, of a particular app, of any service or design that you're pulling together. The good thing about talking about a use experience is that it focuses on the device or service itself. What is it providing, and is it accessible in the broadest sense of the word? The user experience is this subjective bigger picture that many of us work with the emotions, the utility, the aesthetics, and the trust that I mentioned before. The interesting thing about once we say user experience is that it's less limiting than user experience, but we often think about the user as a persona or someone that is recognizable. And especially when dealing with senior leadership, there are use cases and scenarios that are based on the user that is recognizable. And that is a problem often for designing for broader categories of people and for use experiences. We know this to be the case because as soon as we start to bring in issues around accessibility, accessibility is seen to be something for users on the margins, which of course is not true. It's actually about the use for all kinds of people. So each of these different ways of framing also brings its own set of problems for thinking about use experience and user experience. So UX is too broad. As I say, this is something that has been taught to me. But the counterpoint is that we do have diverse elements, and there are many frameworks and principles and methodologies that define UX as a discipline and showcase how the experiences come together, fit together. Those small elements I talked about, those different facets come together. Unfortunately, many of those frameworks, and again, I just did a quick search to look at, what's available. These will all be familiar to the audience, I'm sure, don't speak to each other. And senior leadership and people outside of our discipline don't fully understand them. The questions that are being posed and asked often don't have simple answers, but simple answers are requested. And I'd love to ask the audience, how many times have you come up with a framework to explain the complex, multifaceted aspects of a user experience and try to keep the short, momentary interactions and the long-term value into the conversation? It's a real challenge. It's a real challenge. So the other thing I'm sure people have experienced it in talking to senior leadership is the conflation of UX and UI. So UX is often incorrectly used interchangeably with UI, whereas as we've talked about, UX really is a much bigger picture of the whole experience in the short term and the long term. The UI is the surface moment of interaction. And that UI, typically in the digital industry, in the technology industry, is associated with a screen, but we know more and more and more it's actually about the multimodal interaction, audio, gaming, physical, visual. Sitting in a car is a holistic experience of information design, information designed in the right way for the right moment, in the right place at the right time. And that is a much bigger picture than the screen, the flat screen and the quick interaction for a discretionary use. So I do think that UX and UI are not understood by people outside our disciplines. UX is the foundation, including research and strategy. And I use the word strategy very carefully because I think strategy is part of our remit. And good UI is built upon and within a strategic framework for a bigger holistic picture of UX. So the other thing that I have come across over the years is that everybody creates the user experience. So anyone who contributes, from marketing to UX design to strategic leadership with vision and user requests and use cases to product management, everyone creates it. So UX as a discipline does not own it. In some senses, that is true. And also, it highlights a really important function of UX. UX typically is a horizontal persuasion function. What UX people do is thread between different disciplines, from product management to engineering to marketing to understand that holistic experience. Sure, one might be working on a specific interface at one moment, trying to figure out if the audio, the conversational interface, or the visual touchscreen interface is perfect. But actually, all of that sits within a much bigger picture of threading together the needs, requirements, requests of a whole team, plus the needs, requirements, and requests of the ultimate end users. So UX is a threading and translational discipline that brings together many, many different voices. So everyone does create the user experience, but part of being a user experience researcher or designer or in a leadership capacity is threading those voices together. And that work is often not recognized as being UX work, but it is essential to what we try to do and what we're trying to achieve, and needs to be more recognized. So we do have specific skills. We have user research and understanding human behavior. We have information architecture and intuitive design. We have interaction design and usability testing, all as part of the UX functions. We do understand how to understand context, understanding how context affects use, and how use cases that are too limited will be a problem if some technology is used in a slightly different way or by people that we have not considered because they weren't the canonical persona. This collaborating across teams to make user-centric decisions is something we do really well. And we need to be recognized for that, and recognized a lot more, in my opinion. So in summary, before I start to just go on about I've got a couple of things that I'm really excited about, but also probably not new, but I'd love to have a conversation around these things because they actually push that boundary of what is user experience as a discipline, as a multidisciplinary cohort. What is that going to look like in the future, and what role do we have to play if there is to be such a thing called user experience? So the summary here is that, experience is too subjective and we can't actually codify it in any way. And I believe we can. And we need to talk a lot more across the multidisciplines of UX. UX is too broad. I don't believe that, but I understand if we're not giving the right frameworks and explaining in the right way, it can be considered to be too broad. There is a conflation of UX and UI work, and I think that's because user interface work is understandable in a way that UX work in its broader remit of this subjective experience and this multidisciplinary approach is hard for people to grasp. And this idea that everyone creates the user experience, I believe that everyone is involved, and I believe that deep disciplinary knowledge leads to high quality results. And how do we start to share that more effectively and work together more effectively to get to that overarching, overall big picture? That is sort of the question on my mind. And the question on my mind is to you, how do you and will you explain the discipline of UX as we go forward? How do you do it now? And how will you do it going forward? Because our future challenge in the world of AI and multi-device network infrastructures is huge. It's very exciting and it's huge. It's no longer one person with one device, hasn't been for quite a while, but it's going to get more and more the case. So, single user versus multi-user. We know that for many of the methodologies of evaluation, which are focused on the use cases of usability, learnability, efficiency, those are still important, but they do not help us really deeply understand how people are sharing an experience, like a game, for example, in a co-located way. We've got new methods for understanding that. What is the experience of that? How does it break down? What do we need to worry about? And we've been thinking about this for many years now, but there still aren't clear frameworks that can be understood about what to build, when, and how. We've had a lot of investment in the last 10 years in smart homes and devices in the home. These are going to change, and they are changing. And one thing we deeply understood from doing studies is that this is not a single user device, it's a multi-user device with really interesting authentication issues. And the dream of these devices in our home were very smart assistantship. The UX was meant to make our lives easier, and it has made our lives easier in very constrained ways. Typically, results show that people ask about the news, the weather, the commute, and maybe some shopping, recipes, these sorts of things. Research also shows that the user experience can be quite fraught if you live in a house full of a lot of people who are all trying to use the devices in different ways, and where you're trying to put boundaries in between, for example, adults and children. So interesting ideas and multi-user social contexts have raised that whole experience up to a bigger question, back to the feng shui moment of living in a space that is harmonious. Many of these devices, we don't have a good harmonious user experience judgment story around. We're also going to be really blurring between the physical and digital, or what I call the extended user. By the way, I used one of the visual Gen AI services to create these visuals. I was just having a bit of fun with those, and they illustrate some of the things I'm going to talk about right now. What are we going to do in UX to make sure we have seamless context-aware transitions with responsive interfaces, with location-based triggers, sensor-driven adaptivity? These are really adaptability. These are really interesting technical substrates that it would be great if we can tell the story of the experience that we want people to have and understand how these get deployed effectively together. There's visuals, haptics, different modalities of interacting. And as yet, I don't know, maybe somebody in the audience does, but a multi-sensory design language that's consistent across both physical and digital interactions with a product or brand approach towards it. How are we going to do that? What an interesting idea. Again, there might be something out there that I don't know about, but I'm really excited about this. So extending the user more, the tangible interfaces, which I just mentioned, voice and gesture control. And control is a really important word as we go forward in the AI world, because what are the natural interactions, and how are gestures and voices intuitive and responsive? And what are we going to do also to be really broadly multicultural in these? Because one of the things we know is that many of these voice interfaces are located to very specific languages and are not inclusive of all languages, understandably so, but what's going to happen in the future? What about computer vision? Do we want computer vision to be used? What is the user experience of having something that is really easy to use because your camera is figuring something out, but also maybe a little creepy because your camera is figuring something out? We don't know yet. AI itself, the representation of the user. What about how are we understanding who the user is in the representation? We've all lived with personalization for shopping for a very long time. Gets it right sometimes, gets it wrong sometimes. How are we as UXers, with all of those different angles that I mentioned earlier, going to think about how we can get an explanation of what the AI is doing when a user is interacting? Control and agency. How can we have interfaces that allow us to tweak, see what's going on and tweak, and choose what we want, and have a conversation at the data level around explainability and control and agency? What is the user experience there? Bias. I alluded to bias. How do we understand what the data sets are? So it's no longer the user in user interaction. It's the user, the human, with multiple layers of agents who are also bringing in information from multiple sources. It's not a single monolithic AI. It's multiple AI services and techniques. Each of those might have their own biases. How are we going to surface that so that the human in the loop, the person, understands what is going on and can perhaps navigate between the different agents, just like we currently navigate between the different disciplines of product design? How can we get some transparency and uncover and interact with agents that are using certain data sources? That's all about trust. Back to that big boil the ocean concept of trust. How are we going to get trustworthiness and respect for the user data? How are we going to give people genuine control? And finally, big questions. Users in the long term are going to be the people that we work with in healthcare, education, environment, humanitarian aid. These kinds of social good arenas are problem first, not technology first. There are some sustainable development goals that we all can get access to and think about. And so when I had the provocation, which is there's no such thing as user experience, it's partly how do we talk about our discipline, but also how do we go into the future of these big, wonderful challenges that are coming up right now? And where do we locate ourselves in the conversations? I'm going to finish with this. I have a phrase that I always say, which is UX is broad, and it goes from pixel to policy. It goes from actions at the interface, whether it's audio, visual, whatever, workflows and journeys, the contexts of use, which include cultural differences, and then requirements and regulations that actually constrain or advise how things are built, accessibility being one, where there are clear standards. So whether you're at the pixel level or the policy level, UX is broad, but together in conversation, we can actually start to talk about which piece of the triangle we're touching and in which domain. And so there is no such thing as UX, because UX is everywhere, but we actually do have very specific areas we can work on together. And so I'm pleased that there are conferences like this so that we can actually start talking to each other, not just about the pragmatics of our day-to-day work in context, having complex conversations with people who don't understand UX or who do and really value it, but also about what's the bigger picture for us as a discipline going forward. And so with that, how will you describe and explain the discipline of UX and how we go forward? And with that, I want to say thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That was fantastically interesting. If you have any questions to the audience, we are here and monitoring or comments. I loved UX as a holistic practice. That was fantastic.
And we have to be in it together because we can't do it alone. It's a big project.
Yes, I feel like, correct me if I'm wrong, I feel like I heard from you that UX is everyone's responsibility through an entire product, projects, so on.
Yeah, I think it's everyone's responsibility, and there are people like the folks at this event who are deeply trained. And so enthusiasm and passion is to be applauded, and expertise and critical thinking, in the best sense of the word critical, are to be shared gently, thoughtfully, and robustly. because everybody, I don't know, there's something about when you're in UX, everyone says, well, everyone's like me and I know the answer to that. Or, I know the whole answer to all of social media because my daughter uses social media. I mean, these are the sorts of statements that one has to go, thank you for your interest. And there's a bigger perspective.
Indeed. All right. Well, I think that is about it for us this afternoon. Thank you so much for being here and sharing everything with us.
Thank you. And again, thank you to everybody who allowed me to stay home and just get well. I really, really appreciate it. My email is there. If you have questions or thoughts that you'd like to follow up, please just drop me a note. And again, big thanks to the organizers. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Really quickly, a couple came through.
Oh, okay.
Let's see. Matthew Phillips says, I agree with your comments about UX weaving conversation together. How do we communicate the value of this?
Matthew, that's really important. One of the ways that I have been doing this is I talk to my management chain and I very explicitly say that as a essentially horizontal function, we listen to different stories and bring the stories together. So engineering to PM to all of the different functions, I am very explicit about the fact that we do this. And whenever we have decks or reports, I make sure that all of the people that we have talked to are included as, if not authors, acknowledgements. And I make sure that content is shared and it is essentially co-authored. That's to highlight that we really are in conversation. When I'm in my more academic head, I talk about UX as being an organizational ethnography, like an anthropologist in an organization, trying to understand what the ultimate needs are and goals are, but that, we need to have the engineering and the design and the research and the PM all talking to each other. And I try to go in and figure out where there are communication blockers and where there are opportunities for changing the conversation. So it tends to be very organic and bottom up with these clear things like shared decks, shared documents. And one of the things I say when people come into the team is, you're a highly trained, designer, researcher, etc. And you think that, 80% of your work is going to be design or research. Well, actually, it's going to be about 60% of your work, because 40% of your work is going to be about communication and organizational design. So I don't know about your context and how possible that is, but it's a very explicit goal that I always have. I'd be happy to chat with you more about that if you want to be in touch with me.
Fantastic. There is another one. Shelby Schumacher says, many people like to think about the visual UI aspects of projects first before taking time to think about the UX research and strategy. What would your best recommendations be to shift an organization's perspective and practices in that regard? Do you have an example that you could share?
So answer the first part. I don't know the context that you're working in, but I would get very involved with the product management team or whoever's setting the strategy for the product. And I would sit in, presumably you have some kind of review of the visual interaction elements. So I would make sure of initially sitting in on some of those reviews to just try and get an understanding of why something was designed the way it was designed. If it's an early stage product, you probably have a lot more chance of getting in earlier and starting to do strategic discussions around the creation of that visual element. If it's later stage, it tends to be a little harder, but if you can see new features coming out, you can talk about the strategic ways in which you would like to engage with what are the right features for people. In terms of specific examples, I think I don't have a specific example, but what I can say is that when I set up research for material design, the design system for Google, which is now Google Design Platform, it took a while for me to get in ahead of the game of talking to partners about what their needs were, so that I could help the designers figure out how, as research, we could help understand what are the right patterns and so forth. So all of these things take a while, but getting in on the conversation and being part of the conversation around the new features or the new product by just saying, I'm listening in, I'm trying to bring the user perspective. It's a game of patience, but it's very important. And I have always found that designers, visual and interaction designers, when you sit and talk about what is the ultimate goal here, what are we trying to achieve, they are fantastic partners. So again, I don't know your context, but trying to get in on those conversations early and building partnerships on the ground more organically, I think will potentially lead to some change. And again, I'm happy to chat with you about your particular context.
Right. Anyone have any further questions? Okay, if you don't have any further thoughts, I think we are going to wrap it up. Thank you so much for your talk. It's fabulous.
Thank you so much for hosting. Very much appreciated. And thank you for your attention, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.